Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1. The Meeting. The wind howled through the narrow streets of Montreal, tugging at scarves, rustling through the bare branches of November trees, and scattering the golden remnants of autumn leaves. Arjun pulled his coat tighter around himself, his breath visible in the frigid air. The vibrant buzz of Rue Sainte Catherine filled the evening with life. Laughter from a nearby cafe, the distant strum of a street musician's guitar, and the rhythmic clinking of glasses from an upscale bar. Yet, amidst the vibrant backdrop, he felt oddly detached, as though he were watching life unfold from behind a pane of glass. He wasn't entirely sure why he'd decided to walk this way tonight. The midterms looming on the horizon at McGill demanded his attention, but the walls of his dorm room had grown suffocating. Besides, it had been weeks since he allowed himself a break. Weeks since he did anything but study. His mind buzzed with medical terminology, and his dreams were haunted by diagrams of the human anatomy. Tonight, he needed an escape. His boots crunched over the thin crust of frost on the sidewalk as he reached a small, dimly lit bookstore. Its display window was unassuming, almost hidden among the flashing lights of the surrounding shops, but something about it called to him. Maybe it was the soft glow of the hanging fairy lights inside, or the way the faint smell of old books seemed to seep into the chilly air even from outside. Pushing open the door, he was greeted by warmth, a comforting embrace after the biting cold. The shop was small, its shelves towering and packed with books that looked like they'd been there for decades. The air was thick with the smell of aged paper and ink, mingled with the faint aroma of coffee from somewhere deeper inside. A faint chime announced his presence, and he stepped in, letting the door close softly behind him. Looking for something specific? The voice was gentle, yet it carried an edge of curiosity that made Arjun pause. He turned, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. She was perched on a wooden ladder, balancing precariously as she tried to return a book to an impossibly high shelf. Strands of dark hair had escaped her loose braid, falling across her face as she concentrated on her task. Her eyes, dark and warm, flickered toward him, and for a moment Arjun felt an unfamiliar jolt in his chest. No, just browsing," he managed to stammer, suddenly hyper-aware of how awkward he sounded. She smiled faintly, her lips curling in a way that hinted she'd seen through him. "Take your time," she said, turning back to her work. Arjun wandered deeper into the store, letting his fingers trail along the spines of books whose titles he didn't bother to read. Instead, his mind replayed the image of her, the way she moved, the sound of her voice, the curve of her smile. He shook his head, annoyed with himself. He didn't even know her name. After what felt like an eternity, he found himself at the counter, clutching a book he didn't really want, just to have an excuse to talk to her again. She was behind the counter now, scribbling something in a leather-bound notebook. The ladder stood abandoned nearby, the book she had been shelving nowhere in sight. "That all?" she asked, glancing up at him. Her eyes lingered on his face for a moment, and Arjun swore he saw something flicker in them. Recognition, maybe, or curiosity. "Yeah," he replied, placing the book on the counter. "Looks interesting." She glanced at the title and raised an eyebrow. "A Brief History of Medical Blunders. You're a med student, aren't you?" "How did you?" She smirked, holding up her hands. "Relax, it's not magic. You've got that look. Tired, slightly panicked, like you've been awake for 3 days straight memorizing Latin terms." Arjun laughed despite himself. "Guilty as charged. You're pretty good at this." "Part of the job," she said, tapping her temple. "People-watching skills come with the territory." "What about you?" he asked, emboldened by her easy demeanor. "Are you a student too, or do you just live among books?" Her expression softened. "Both, I guess. I study literature at Concordia. This place, it's a part-time gig, but it feels like home, you know?" He nodded, though he wasn't sure he did know. He'd never felt particularly at home anywhere, not even back in Cornwall. "I'm Arjun," he offered, sticking out his hand. She hesitated for a split second before shaking it, her grip firm but warm. "Dia," she replied. "Dia." The name rolled around in his mind, fitting her in ways he couldn't quite explain. For the next hour they talked, her laughter ringing out softly as they exchanged stories about their studies, their cities, their lives. The world outside the bookstore seemed to fade, its noise and chaos replaced by the quiet hum of conversation and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath them. Eventually, the clock on the wall chimed softly, reminding them both of the hour. "I should lock up," Dia said, regret evident in her voice. "Right," Arjun agreed, though he made no move to leave. "Maybe I'll see you around?" "Maybe," she said, smiling that same mysterious smile that had hooked him in the first place. As he stepped back into the cold night, the warmth of their conversation lingered. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in months he felt alive, truly alive. And as he walked back toward his dorm, the weight of his books, his studies, and his life seemed a little lighter. Little did he know, this was only the beginning. Chapter 2. The Bookstore Encounter. The days following Arjun's chance meeting with Dia passed in a blur of lectures, late-night study sessions, and hastily eaten meals in the crowded McGill cafeteria. Yet, no matter how busy he was, the memory of that evening lingered like a persistent shadow. The way she smiled, the cadence of her voice, the warmth in her laugh, it was all etched into his mind. He found himself walking by the bookstore more often than he cared to admit. Sometimes he'd pause outside the window, pretending to study the display while secretly hoping to catch a glimpse of her. But each time, the store seemed quiet, its lights dimmed, or its shelves empty of the person he was searching for. It wasn't until a week later, on a particularly gray and drizzly afternoon, that he saw her again. The bell chimed softly as Arjun stepped into the bookstore, shaking the cold droplets from his umbrella. The warmth welcomed him like an old friend, the familiar scent of books and coffee enveloping him instantly. This time, the store was nearly empty, save for an elderly man leafing through a leather-bound volume in the corner. And there she was, behind the counter, her head bent over a book, completely absorbed. Her braid was gone, replaced by loose waves that framed her face. A single pen was tucked behind her ear, and she occasionally scribbled notes in the margins of the page she was reading. For a moment, Arjun simply stood there, unsure of how to approach. He felt ridiculous, like a character in one of those cliché romance novels his sister loved so much. But before he could overthink further, she looked up and spotted him. "Arjun," she said, her lips curling into a smile that sent a strange warmth flooding through him. "Back for more medical blunders?" He chuckled, stepping closer to the counter. "Not this time. I think I'm ready to branch out." "Bold move," she teased, closing her book and leaning forward slightly. "What are you in the mood for? Mystery? Sci-fi? Maybe something a little tragic?" "Definitely not tragic," he said quickly, earning a soft laugh from her. "All right," she said, sliding off her stool. "Let's find something for you." As Dia guided him through the maze of bookshelves, Arjun couldn't help but notice how at ease she seemed, that like she belonged in this space in a way few people belonged anywhere. She moved with purpose, her fingers brushing lightly over book spines as she spoke about authors and genres with genuine passion. "You seem to know this place inside out," he said, watching her pull a worn paperback from the shelf and hand it to him. "After 2 years of working here, you kind of have to," she replied. "But it's more than that. I've always loved books. They're safe. You know? You can lose yourself in them, escape for a while." He nodded, though he couldn't fully relate. For him, books had always been about studying, learning, preparing for the future. They'd never been an escape. "What about you?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "What do you do to escape?" Arjun hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I don't, I guess. Not really." Dia raised an eyebrow. "Not even music? Movies? A secret obsession with bad reality TV?" He laughed. "No secret obsessions. I've always been focused on school. My parents, they've put a lot into getting me here, and I don't want to let them down." Her expression softened, a flicker of understanding passing through her eyes. "That's a lot of pressure." "It is," he admitted. "But it's worth it, I think. Or at least I hope it will be." Dia studied him for a moment, then smiled. "Maybe you should let yourself escape every once in a while. It's not about running away. It's about giving yourself room to breathe." Her words stayed with him as they returned to the counter, where he paid for the book she'd picked out for him. The Night Circus. "You'll love it," she said, slipping the book into a brown paper bag. "It's magical." I'll let you know what I think, he promised. You'd better, she replied, handing him the bag, or I'll have to hunt you down and make you tell me. They shared a laugh, and as Arjun left the store, the rain had eased into a light drizzle. The gray sky seemed a little brighter, the cold a little less biting. That evening, as he sat on his dorm bed with the night circus in hand, Arjun realized something strange. For the first time in weeks, his mind wasn't consumed by school or exams or the endless expectations he placed on himself. Instead, it was filled with thoughts of Dia, her voice, her smile, and the way she seemed to see right through him. And as he turned the first page of the book, he couldn't help but wonder if she was right. Maybe letting himself escape every once in a while wasn't such a bad idea. Chapter 3. The Coffee Invitation. The days grew colder as November bled into December, Montreal donning its winter coat of frost and flurries. Arjun's schedule remained relentless, but amidst the chaos of lectures and labs, he found moments of quiet solace in the night circus. Dia had been right. It was magical, weaving a story so immersive that Arjun often forgot the world around him while reading. But it wasn't just the book that lingered in his mind. It was her. Every page seemed to carry her voice, her excitement for stories, her quiet wisdom. The thought of seeing her again had become a beacon, a small but vital light in the otherwise monotonous grind of his days. So one Saturday afternoon, armed with the finished book and a mix of nerves and anticipation, Arjun found himself back at the bookstore. The bell jingled softly as he stepped inside, the warmth enveloping him like always. This time, the store was a little busier. A mother and child browsed picture books near the entrance, while a pair of students whispered excitedly over a stack of used novels. And there she was, at the far end of the store, reorganizing a shelf. She hadn't noticed him yet, her back turned as she balanced on tiptoe to reach the higher rows. "Hey," Arjun called softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, a smile lighting up her face the moment she saw him. "Arjun, back for another book already?" "Not exactly," he said, holding up the night circus. "I came to return this, or at least report back on it. You were right, it was amazing." Daya's eyes lit up with delight as she walked toward him. "I told you. The prose, the imagery, it's like stepping into a dream, isn't it?" "It really is. I think I read it slower on purpose just so it wouldn't end," he admitted, laughing. Her smile widened. "That's the best kind of book. So, are you ready for your next adventure, or do you need a breather?" "Actually," Arjun hesitated, suddenly feeling foolish for what he was about to say. But there was no turning back now. "I was wondering if you'd like to grab coffee sometime? You know, outside of the bookstore." For a moment, Dia's expression was unreadable, and Arjun felt his heart sink. But then she smiled, soft, warm, and a little surprised. "Coffee sounds great," she said. Relief washed over him, and he nodded quickly, trying not to let his excitement show too much. "Great. When are you free?" Dia glanced at the clock on the wall. "I actually have a break in about 15 minutes. If you don't mind waiting, we could go then?" "Perfect," Arjun replied, feeling like he'd just won the lottery. 15 minutes later, they were sitting across from each other in a cozy cafe just down the street. The place was quiet, its soft jazz music and the hum of an espresso machine creating a warm, inviting atmosphere. Arjun clutched his mug of hot chocolate, his nerves tempered by the sight of Dia sipping her latte across from him. "So," she began, leaning forward slightly, "tell me, how does a medical student end up at a tiny bookstore on a random Thursday night?" He laughed, scratching the back of his neck. "Honestly, I was just trying to clear my head. It's easy to get stuck in this cycle of work and stress. And that night, I just needed something different. That's when I saw the store." "And then you saw me," Dia teased, her eyes sparkling. Arjun grinned. "Well, yeah, that too. And now you're here, having coffee with a complete stranger." "Not a stranger," he corrected. "You're Dia, the girl who knows books better than anyone I've ever met." She laughed, her cheeks tinged with a faint blush. "Fair enough, but what about you? Who is Arjun, aside from the guy buried under textbooks?" The question caught him off guard, and he took a moment to think. "I guess I'm still figuring that out," he admitted. "Most of my life has been about doing what I'm supposed to do, getting good grades, making my parents proud, working toward a stable future. But lately I've been wondering if there's more to it than that. Dia nodded, her gaze thoughtful. That's a hard question to answer, especially when everyone around you seems to expect something specific. But I think it's good to ask it, to figure out what makes you happy. What about you? He asked. Do you know what makes you happy? She smiled, stirring her latte absently. Stories. Creating them, reading them, sharing them. That's why I love this job, even if it doesn't pay much. It's not just about the books, it's about the people who love them too. Arjun studied her, struck by the quiet conviction in her voice. She seemed so certain of herself, so at home in her passions. It was something he envied, but also admired. I think you're the kind of person who could do anything, he said before he could stop himself. Dia blinked, surprised, then laughed softly. That's a lot of faith for someone who barely knows me. Maybe, Arjun said, smiling. But I think it's true. They talked for what felt like hours, the world outside the cafe fading into the background. Dia told him about her favorite authors, her dreams of writing her own novel someday, and the quirks of working at the bookstore. Arjun shared stories from his childhood in Cornwall, the struggles of being so far from home, and his growing love for the city. By the time they stepped back into the cold, the sky had darkened, and snow had begun to fall, soft and silent. Thanks for the coffee, Dia said, her breath visible in the frosty air. Thanks for saying yes, Arjun replied. As they stood there, the snow swirling around them, Arjun felt an unfamiliar but welcome sense of possibility. For the first time in a long time, the path ahead didn't feel so rigid, so predetermined. And as Dia smiled at him, her eyes bright and full of life, he couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something extraordinary. Chapter 4. Snowfall and Secrets. The snow fell heavier that night, blanketing Montreal in a quiet hush. By morning, the streets were a pristine white, the usual hum of the city subdued by the thick layer of winter's touch. Arjun woke to the muffled sounds of shovels scraping pavement and the occasional whoop of a child celebrating the season's first real snowfall. His phone buzzed on the desk beside him, jolting him fully awake. Rubbing his eyes, he reached for it and saw a message from Dia. Hey, Snow Day! You busy? A thrill shot through him as he quickly typed back. Not at all. What's up? Her reply came almost instantly. Meet me at Parc La Fontaine. Dress warm. Arjun grinned, already scrambling out of bed. Within half an hour he was bundled up in his thickest coat, scarf, and gloves, making his way to the park. The cold bit at his cheeks, but he hardly noticed, his excitement fueling him as he navigated the snow-dusted streets. When he arrived, he spotted her almost immediately. Dia was standing near a frozen pond, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold, a bright red toque perched atop her head. She waved when she saw him, her smile as warm as the sun despite the icy weather. You made it, she called, her breath visible in the crisp air. Wouldn't miss it, he replied, his voice muffled by his scarf. Good, she said, holding up a pair of skates. Because you're about to learn how to ice skate. Arjun froze, staring at the skates in her hands. You're joking, right? I've never skated in my life. I'll probably break my leg. Dia laughed, the sound light and teasing. Don't worry, Dr. Future. If you fall, I'll save you. Come on. It's fun. Before he could protest further, she grabbed his arm and led him to the edge of the pond. A small crowd of families, couples, and children glided across the ice, their laughter echoing in the chilly air. Reluctantly, Arjun sat on the bench and swapped his boots for the skates she'd brought. They felt awkward and unstable, and he wobbled dangerously as he stood. This is a terrible idea, he muttered, gripping the back of the bench for dear life. Dia rolled her eyes, already gliding effortlessly onto the ice. You're overthinking it. Just relax and trust your balance. Easy for you to say, Arjun replied, cautiously stepping onto the ice. Immediately, his legs slipped in opposite directions, and he grabbed at her for support. She caught him, barely stifling her laughter. Okay, maybe don't relax that much, she said, steadying him. Over the next hour, Dia patiently guided him across the ice. At first, it was a disaster. Arjun's every attempt at movement ended with flailing arms and near falls, but gradually he started to find his rhythm. With Dia's encouragement and a lot of laughter, he managed a few unsteady glides without holding on to her. You're a natural, she teased as he wobbled to a stop near the edge of the pond. A natural disaster, he shot back, grinning despite himself. They skated until their fingers and toes were numb, then retreated to a nearby cafe for hot chocolate. As they warmed up, the conversation turned deeper, the playful teasing giving way to something more personal. "Do you miss it?" Daya asked suddenly, staring into her cup. "Miss what?" "Home, Cornwall." Arjun hesitated, surprised by the question. "Sometimes," he admitted. "It's hard being so far away, especially during moments like this. Back home, snow days were always about family. My sister and I would build snowmen or have epic snowball fights. I miss that." Dia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I get that. I'm from Toronto, and even though it's not that far, it feels like another world sometimes. My parents call every weekend to share, but it's not the same as being there, you know?" "Yeah," Arjun said softly. "I know." For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the snow fall outside the window. Then Dia spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "There's something I haven't told you," she began, her gaze fixed on her cup. Arjun leaned forward, sensing the shift in her tone. "What is it?" She hesitated, chewing her bottom lip as though debating whether to continue. "It's just... I don't usually let people in this quickly. Most of the time I keep my distance. It's easier that way." "Why?" Arjun asked gently. Dia looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "Because I've been hurt before, by people I trusted, and sometimes it feels safer to just stay on the outside." Her honesty caught him off guard, and he felt a pang of protectiveness he couldn't quite explain. "You don't have to stay on the outside with me," he said after a moment. "I get it. Trusting people can be hard. But I'm not going anywhere, Daya." She smiled, a little sadly. "You say that now, but things change, Arjun. People leave." "Not me," he said firmly. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the air between them thick with unspoken emotions. Then Dia broke the tension with a small laugh. "All right, Mr. Reliable, let's see if you can keep up with me on the ice next time." He grinned. Challenge accepted. As they left the cafe and walked back into the snowy evening, Arjun felt something shift between them. It wasn't just a snow day anymore. It was the beginning of something deeper, something fragile but full of promise. And as the snowflakes melted against his skin, he found himself silently hoping that, this time, Dia wouldn't be left standing on the outside. A place to belong. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change. The kind that sneaks up on you, weaving itself into the fabric of your life until you can't remember what it felt like before. Arjun and Daya's friendship deepened, their moments together becoming a constant amid the chaos of university life. Late-night conversations, study sessions turned into philosophical debates, and spontaneous adventures across Montreal filled their days. But the closer they grew, the more Arjun sensed a wall within Dia, an invisible barrier she had carefully built to protect herself. She let him in just far enough to see glimpses of her pain, snippets of a childhood marked by disappointment, of friendships that had ended in betrayal. Every time he tried to push past the wall, she'd retreat, her smile a mask that said, "Don't dig deeper. It's safer this way." Until one day she didn't. It was late March, the first hints of spring softening the edges of the city's long winter. They were sitting on a bench overlooking the St. Lawrence River, the icy waters reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. Dia was unusually quiet, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Do you ever wonder if you're where you're supposed to be?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Arjun turned to her, surprised. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, fiddling with the hem of her coat. "I've spent so much of my life running. From expectations, from people who hurt me, from myself. And sometimes I wonder if I'll ever stop, if I'll ever find a place where I feel like I truly belong." Her words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. For a moment, Arjun didn't know what to say. Then he reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "You belong wherever you decide to stay," he said softly. "And for what it's worth, I think you found that place. At least, I hope you have." Dia looked at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Why do you care so much, Arjun? Why do you keep trying when I keep pulling away?" "Because you're worth it," he said simply. "You're worth every moment, every effort. And I care because I see you, Dia, the real you. Not the one who hides behind books or laughter or walls. The one who's brave enough to admit she's scared, but keeps going anyway. For the first time, Dia let her walls crumble. The tears spilled over, and she didn't try to stop them. Arjun wrapped his arms around her, holding her close as she cried. The following months were transformative. Dia began to let herself trust again, not just Arjun, but the people around her. She started writing in earnest, sharing her stories with Arjun, who became her biggest cheerleader. He, in turn, found himself opening up in ways he never thought possible. By the time summer arrived, their connection had grown into something undeniable. One evening, as they walked along the cobblestone streets of Old Montreal, Dia stopped abruptly, turning to face him. "Arjun," she said, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty, "I think I'm falling for you." He stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest. "You think?" She laughed, shaking her head. "No, I know. I needed to say it. Because for the first time in my life, I don't want to run." Arjun smiled, his hand reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her face. "Good. Because I'm not going anywhere." The kiss that followed wasn't perfect. It was clumsy and nervous, but it was theirs, honest and real. Years later, as they stood in the same bookstore where they had first met, now transformed into a cozy cafe and literary hub co-owned by Dia, they couldn't help but marvel at how far they'd come. Arjun had just finished his residency, and Dia's first novel was set to be published in the fall. The walls were lined with books, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. A small group of students was seated in a corner, debating over a stack of novels. "It feels like a lifetime ago," Dia said, her fingers laced with Arjun's. "That night you walked in here, looking completely lost." "I was lost," he admitted with a laugh. "But then I found you." She rolled her eyes playfully but leaned in to kiss his cheek. "You're such a sap!" "And you love it," he shot back, grinning. Dia didn't deny it. Instead, she squeezed his hand and looked around the space they'd built together, a space that felt like home. Because in the end, it wasn't about running or staying or searching for the perfect place. It was about finding the right person to share it with. And in each other, they had found everything they needed. The end. Chapter 1. Fate on the Edge of the World. The sun hovered just above the horizon, casting long shadows across the cobbled streets of Avalon, a small seaside town perched on the cliffs of England's rugged coast. The town was alive with the soft hum of conversation, the distant cry of seagulls, and the scent of salt in the air. Among the winding alleyways, here's a detailed, immersive first chapter for a love story. It's open-ended, so the ending can be developed as you like. Chapter 1. Fate on the Edge of the World. The sun hovered just above the horizon, casting long shadows across the cobbled streets of Avalon, a small seaside town perched on the cliffs of England's rugged coast. The town was alive with the soft hum of conversation, the distant cry of seagulls, and the scent of salt in the air. Among the winding alleyways and weathered shop fronts, a bookshop stood quietly, its wooden sign creaking in the breeze. Elderwood Tales. Inside, the shop smelled of old paper and lavender, a comforting aroma that wrapped around visitors like an old blanket. Sophia Hart, the shop's owner, stood behind the counter, meticulously arranging a stack of newly arrived leather-bound classics. Her auburn hair was loosely tied back, strands escaping to frame a face dusted with freckles. She wasn't what anyone would call stunningly beautiful, but her presence was magnetic, a quiet grace that turned heads. Sophia loved the bookshop more than anything else in the world. It was her sanctuary, her anchor in the relentless tide of life. She had taken over Elderwood Tales after her grandmother passed away, pouring every ounce of her heart into its upkeep. On most days, the shop felt like a world apart from reality, a place where time slowed and the chaos of the outside world disappeared. Today, however, something was different. The bell above the door jingled, announcing a customer. Sophia looked up, her polite greeting dying on her lips as her eyes met his. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark, wavy hair slightly damp, as if he'd just come from the sea. His face was rugged but kind, with deep-set hazel eyes that held a glint of curiosity. He wore a black peacoat and carried a worn leather satchel slung over one shoulder. For a moment, the two of them just stared at each other, the space between them charged with an inexplicable energy. Sorry, he said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was warm and rich, tinged with an accent Sophia couldn't quite place. I didn't mean to intrude. I'm looking for a book. Sophia cleared her throat, trying to steady herself. You're in the right place for that, she replied, forcing a small smile. He returned the smile, and it was like the sun breaking through a stormy sky. I'm looking for something about the history of the coast, he explained, his eyes scanning the shelves. I just moved here, and thought it might help me get to know the place. Welcome to Avalon, Sophia said, stepping out from behind the counter. We don't get many new faces around here. Well, I suppose I'm a bit of an anomaly, he said, his smile widening. Name's Elijah, by the way. Sophia, she said, extending her hand. His handshake was firm but gentle, his touch lingering just a moment longer than necessary. She led him to a section in the back, where books about local history and folklore were tucked away. As she explained the collection, Elijah listened intently, his gaze flickering between her and the books. I've always been fascinated by coastal towns like this, he said, pulling a book off the shelf. There's something timeless about them, like they're holding on to secrets the rest of the world has forgotten. Sophia nodded, her heart fluttering at his words. Avalon definitely has its share of secrets. If you like folklore, you'll love the legends about the cliffs. Legends? Elijah asked, his eyebrows rising in intrigue. According to local lore, the cliffs are enchanted, Sophia explained. They say that lovers who meet there are bound together forever. Elijah chuckled softly. Sounds like a good place for a first date. Sophia felt her cheeks flush. Maybe, she said, avoiding his gaze. They spent the next hour talking, the conversation flowing effortlessly. Sophia found herself captivated by Elijah's stories of traveling the world, his passion for photography, and his dreams of finding a place to call home. In turn, she shared bits of her own life, the love she had for the bookshop, her memories of growing up in Avalon, and her secret desire to write a novel one day. When Elijah finally left, with a book tucked under his arm and a promise to return, Sophia felt as if the air had shifted. The shop seemed quieter, emptier without him. That night, as she closed up the shop, she found herself standing on the edge of the cliffs, gazing out at the endless expanse of ocean. The waves crashed against the rocks below, a rhythmic melody that echoed in her chest. She thought of Elijah's smile, the way his eyes had lit up when he spoke about the sea. For the first time in years, Sophia felt a spark of something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. Chapter 2. Threads in the Tapestry. The following week passed in a haze of routine for Sophia, but her thoughts often wandered back to Elijah. The bookshop hummed with its usual rhythm, locals stopping by to browse, the occasional tourist marveling at the collection of rare volumes. Yet, every time the bell above the door chimed, her heart leapt, anticipating his return. It wasn't until Thursday afternoon that he appeared again. The weather had turned, with thick gray clouds rolling over the town, and rain drummed softly against the shop's windows. Sophia was perched on a stool behind the counter, lost in a novel, when his voice pulled her back to reality. Still busy saving Avalon one reader at a time? She looked up to see Elijah standing in the doorway, his coat glistening with raindrops. He smiled, and the shop instantly felt warmer. You caught me, she replied, closing her book and stepping down from the stool. Let me guess, another book about Avalon? Not today. He held up his satchel, giving it a light shake. Thought I'd bring you something instead. Curiosity flickered in her eyes as he pulled out a carefully wrapped package. The brown paper and string looked almost comically out of place against his rain-slicked coat. He placed it on the counter, gesturing for her to open it. What's this? She asked, untangling the knot with careful fingers. You'll see. Inside was a framed photograph. The composition was breathtaking. A solitary tree stood at the edge of a cliff, its twisted branches reaching toward the stormy sky. The sea below churned with restless energy, and the light seemed to dance on the waves. It was a view Sophia recognized instantly, the very cliffs she had mentioned in their last conversation. You took this? She asked, her voice hushed with awe. Elijah nodded. After we talked about the legends, I couldn't resist seeing the cliffs for myself. Something about them just spoke to me. I wanted you to have this. Sophia's fingers traced the edge of the frame. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "Thank you." Their eyes met, and for a moment the world outside seemed to fade away. "I hope I'm not interrupting your day," Elijah said, breaking the silence. "Not at all," she replied quickly. "Actually, you're just in time. I was about to make tea. Do you want some?" "I'd love that," he said. They settled at the small table near the shop's back corner, where Sophia had set up a cozy seating area for visitors. As the kettle boiled, she arranged 2 mismatched mugs and a tin of biscuits. "So," she said, pouring the tea, "what brought you to Avalon, of all places?" Elijah took a sip, his expression thoughtful. "I guess you could say I was looking for something," he said. "Or maybe trying to escape something. I've spent most of my life moving from one place to another. Avalon felt different, like it might be a place where I could stop running." Sophia nodded, sensing there was more to his story, but not wanting to press. "And how's that working out for you so far?" He smiled. "Well, I've met someone who makes me think it might be worth staying." Sophia's breath caught, but she forced herself to play it cool. "The cliffs?" she teased, raising an eyebrow. Elijah chuckled. "Not exactly." They talked for hours, the rain outside creating a gentle soundtrack to their conversation. Elijah shared more stories about his travels: sunrises in Bali, street markets in Marrakech, nights spent under the stars in the Australian outback. Sophia listened, her imagination painting vivid pictures of the places he described. In turn, she opened up about her own dreams. She told him about the novel she'd been working on for years, a story inspired by the legends of Avalon's cliffs. It was a deeply personal project, one she'd never shared with anyone else. "You should finish it," Elijah said, his tone encouraging. "You've got a way of telling stories that draws people in. I'd love to read it someday." Sophia felt a warmth rise in her chest. "Maybe," she said softly. By the time Elijah left, the rain had stopped, and the sky was beginning to clear. He lingered at the door, turning back to look at her one last time. "Thanks for the tea," he said. "And for the company. I'll see you soon?" Sophia nodded, her smile shy but genuine. "I hope so." As the door closed behind him, the shop felt too quiet again. She looked at the photograph he had given her, now propped up on the counter. The image seemed to pulse with life, as if it were a doorway to another world. Sophia didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she was excited to find out. Waves beneath the surface. Sophia spent the next few days with an unfamiliar lightness in her step. Elijah's photograph now hung on the wall behind the counter, a reminder of the moments they'd shared. Customers noticed it too, often commenting on its striking beauty. Sophia always smiled at their words, but she never mentioned the man who had captured it. The week drifted by, and Friday evening brought with it the return of the autumn fair. Avalon's cobbled streets transformed into a vibrant tapestry of color and sound, with stalls selling handmade crafts, steaming cups of cider, and sugary confections. Fairy lights strung between lampposts bathed the town square in a warm, golden glow. Sophia had always loved the fair. It was one of the few times the sleepy town came alive, drawing people from neighboring villages. This year, however, it felt different. She wandered through the stalls, sipping cider, her thoughts uncharacteristically preoccupied. She hadn't seen Elijah since their afternoon in the bookshop, though his presence lingered in her mind. She told herself it was silly to feel disappointed. After all, they'd only just met. But as she moved through the crowd, scanning faces without meaning to, she couldn't deny the tiny ache in her chest. "Sophia!" a familiar voice called out, snapping her from her thoughts. She turned to see her friend Lily, waving enthusiastically. Lily was Avalon's resident whirlwind of energy, with a halo of curly blonde hair and a laugh that could be heard across the square. "Hey!" Sophia greeted her, grateful for the distraction. "Why are you wandering around on your own?" Lily asked, linking arms with her. "Come on, let's find the fun!" Sophia laughed, letting herself be pulled along. They browsed the stalls, sampled pastries, and tried their luck at the games. For a while, Sophia forgot her restlessness. But as they rounded the corner into a quieter part of the square, her heart skipped a beat. Elijah was there. He stood at a stall selling hand-carved trinkets, his attention fixed on a small wooden pendant. The firelight from a nearby brazier illuminated his profile, highlighting the sharp angles of his face and the soft curve of his lips. Lily noticed Sophia freeze and followed her gaze. "Oh, he's gorgeous," she whispered. "Is he why you've been all dreamy-eyed lately?" "Shh!" Sophia hissed, her cheeks burning. But it was too late. Elijah looked up, his eyes finding hers across the crowd. A slow, easy smile spread across his face, and he raised a hand in greeting. Lily gave Sophia a little nudge. "Go talk to him." Before Sophia could protest, Elijah was already walking toward her. "Hey," he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a warm current. "Fancy meeting you here." "Hey," Sophia replied, trying to sound casual. "I didn't know you were a fan of fairs." "I wasn't planning on coming," he admitted, his hands slipping into his coat pockets. "But then I thought, why not? Glad I did." Lily gave Sophia a knowing look before slipping away into the crowd, leaving them alone. "Did you find anything interesting?" Sophia asked, nodding toward the trinkets. Elijah held up the pendant he'd been examining. It was simple but elegant, a small piece of driftwood shaped like a heart, polished to a soft sheen. "It reminded me of the cliffs," he said. "Thought it might make a nice souvenir." Sophia's heart fluttered. "It's lovely." "Walk with me?" he asked, gesturing toward the quieter streets beyond the square. She hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Together they wove through the crowd and out into the open night. The cool air was laced with the scent of the sea, and the distant sound of waves provided a gentle rhythm to their steps. "You seem at home here," Elijah said after a while. "I guess I am," Sophia replied. "I've lived in Avalon my whole life. It's not perfect, but it's steady." "Steady's good," Elijah said, his gaze thoughtful. "I think I've spent so much time chasing change that I've forgotten what steady feels like." They walked in silence for a moment, the night stretching around them like a comforting blanket. "Why did you move so much?" Sophia asked finally, her voice soft. Elijah hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the horizon. "My dad was in the military," he said. "We never stayed in one place for long, and after he passed, I guess I just kept moving. It felt easier than staying still." "I'm sorry," Sophia said, her chest tightening at the pain in his voice. He shook his head. "It's okay. It's been a long time. But coming here, meeting you, it's made me wonder if maybe it's time to stop running." Sophia's breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to say something, to tell him she felt the same pull, the same connection. But before she could find the words, Elijah stopped walking. They had reached the cliffs. The moonlight painted the landscape in shades of silver and blue, the ocean below shimmering like liquid starlight. Elijah turned to her, his expression unreadable. "There's something about this place," he said quietly, "like it's holding its breath, waiting for something to happen." Sophia nodded, the weight of his words sinking into her. She felt it too, the unspoken tension, the quiet magic of the cliffs. Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out the pendant. "Here," he said, holding it out to her. "I think it belongs with you." Her fingers brushed as she took it, and the contact sent a spark up her arm. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the waves. They stood there for what felt like hours, the world around them fading into nothingness. For the first time in her life, Sophia felt as if she were standing on the edge of something vast and uncharted. And she wasn't afraid. Chapter 4. Cracks Beneath the Surface. The days after the fair passed in a whirlwind of quiet moments and unexpected glances. Sophia found herself waiting for Elijah's visits, the sound of the bell above the shop door becoming a heartbeat of sorts. He had been returning to the bookshop regularly, often dropping by in the early afternoons, when the town was calm and the air held a certain stillness. They spent hours talking, mostly about trivial things. The best coffee spots in town, their favorite childhood books, the weather. But there were moments when their words seemed to brush against something deeper. Something neither of them acknowledged, but both felt. Sophia caught herself thinking about him long after he left, replaying their conversations over and over in her mind. And when she wasn't thinking about him, she found herself missing him. One afternoon, as the autumn chill began to bite at the air, Elijah walked in just as Sophia was finishing a book. She looked up and smiled, pushing her hair behind her ear. "Hey," she greeted him. "Hey." His voice was warmer than usual, and there was an intensity in his eyes that made Sophia's heart race. He seemed different, more present somehow. "I brought you something," he said, his smile slightly hesitant. He pulled out a small notebook from his bag and placed it on the counter. Sophia raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" "It's a journal," he explained. "I thought maybe you'd like it, for your novel or whatever you're writing." He paused. "I've noticed you always have a book with you." Sophia felt a rush of warmth. She didn't expect him to notice, let alone care. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. She traced the leather cover of the journal with her fingers. It was simple, no frills, but the quality of it was clear. "I'll definitely use it." "I hope it helps." Elijah said, his tone unusually serious. He stepped closer, leaning slightly across the counter. "I know what it's like to feel stuck, to need something to pour your thoughts into." Sophia nodded, her chest tightening at the sincerity in his voice. She didn't know what to say, so she simply offered him a small smile. Before she could say anything else, the door opened with a creak, and an elderly woman entered the shop, interrupting the moment. Sophia quickly turned to greet her, but when she looked back at Elijah, he had already taken a step back, his usual easygoing demeanor returning. "Hello, Mrs. Green," Sophia said, smiling at the woman. "What can I help you with today?" As the elderly woman perused the shelves, Elijah lingered near the door, shifting his weight nervously. He glanced at Sophia before saying, "I'll let you get back to work. I just wanted to stop by and say hi." Sophia's heart sank a little, but she masked it quickly. "Of course," she replied. "Thanks for the journal." Elijah gave her one last, lingering look, his eyes filled with something unspoken, before he walked out the door. The evening came slowly, the shop growing quieter as the last customer left, and the town outside sank into a peaceful silence. Sophia found herself sitting behind the counter, the journal still in front of her. She wanted to open it, to write something, anything, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing between her and Elijah. It wasn't just the journal, it was the way he looked at her, the way his presence seemed to weigh more now. She couldn't put it into words, but she could feel it in her bones, and part of her felt scared. As she sat there trying to focus on her thoughts, the bell above the door rang again. This time, it wasn't Elijah. A tall man with sharp features stepped into the shop. His eyes were cold, calculating, and there was a heaviness to his movements that immediately set Sophia on edge. He wore a tailored coat and carried himself with an air of authority that seemed out of place in the cozy warmth of Elderwood tales. "I'm looking for someone," the man said, his voice deep and smooth. Sophia glanced up from her book, her nerves prickling. "Who are you looking for?" she asked carefully. "I'm looking for Elijah," the man said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Is he here?" Sophia felt a sharp pang in her chest. "I haven't seen him today," she replied, trying to remain calm. "Can I help you with something?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he continued to scan the shelves as if searching for something hidden within the books. Finally, he spoke again, his voice colder this time. "Where does he live?" Sophia's breath caught. "I don't know. I'm sorry." The man's eyes narrowed, his gaze locking onto hers. There was a quiet threat in the air, though he didn't raise his voice. "I don't think you understand," he said, his tone dangerously calm. "I'm not asking for your help. I'm telling you." Something in his presence made Sophia's skin crawl. She had to suppress the instinct to step back. "I don't know where he is," she said again, her voice firmer this time. "If you're looking for Elijah, you're going to have to find him yourself." The man stared at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out the door. Sophia stood frozen behind the counter, the silence of the shop almost oppressive. She didn't know who the man was or what he wanted with Elijah, but the encounter left her uneasy. The way he spoke, the way he carried himself, it wasn't just a casual visit. It felt like a warning. Her thoughts raced, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Elijah had never mentioned anyone like that. She glanced at the journal he had given her, her fingers lingering on its cover. Had she really been so blind to what was happening? Had there been more to his past than he'd let on? The weight of her own questions pressed on her chest, and for the first time since meeting him, she found herself doubting. Maybe the cliffs weren't the only thing holding secrets. Chapter 5. The Breaking Point. The next few days were a blur of uncertainty. Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on her, on them. Every time the door to the bookshop chimed, her heart skipped, only to fall in disappointment when it wasn't Elijah standing in the doorway. She hadn't seen him since the night he gave her the journal, and after the strange visit from the man, she couldn't help but wonder if Elijah had been hiding something from her all along. Despite her growing unease, she told herself not to overthink it. Elijah was quiet but kind. He'd never given her any reason to doubt him until now. She could almost hear the echo of the stranger's voice in her mind. "I'm not asking for your help, I'm telling you." But Elijah was different, wasn't he? On the 5th day after the man's visit, the shop was unusually quiet. It was nearing closing time, and Sophia was just finishing tidying up when the bell above the door rang. She didn't look up right away, but when the soft rustle of footsteps drew nearer, she felt the air shift. "Elijah," she whispered, her heart leaping into her throat. He stood there in the doorway, looking as if he hadn't slept in days. His usual carefree expression was replaced with something much heavier. His eyes, those familiar kind eyes, were shadowed with worry. I didn't know where else to go," he said, his voice rough. Sophia felt her breath catch in her chest. "What's going on?" "I never should have brought you into this," Elijah said, stepping closer, his hands trembling at his sides. "I've tried to keep you safe, but I don't know how much longer I can protect you." Sophia took a step toward him, her heart racing. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, glancing around the shop as though expecting the stranger to appear at any moment. "The man who came here, the one who asked about me, he's part of a situation I've been trying to escape. I didn't think it would follow me here." "Who is he?" Sophia asked, her voice trembling. Elijah took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. "His name is Declan. He's from my past. From the life I've been running from." Sophia's stomach twisted. "A life you've been running from? Elijah, you're scaring me." "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I never wanted to drag you into this, but I can't lie anymore. I thought I could protect you from it, but now I don't know how to keep you safe." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Sophia felt a strange sense of betrayal, but it was overshadowed by the need to understand. "What is this life, Elijah? What's going on?" He looked away, his eyes flickering toward the window, as if he could sense Declan's presence even in the absence of the man. "I was involved in something dangerous. I made mistakes, bad ones, and Declan, he's part of that world. He's been looking for me. But this time, I don't think I can outrun it anymore." Sophia felt the weight of his words press down on her chest, and suddenly everything felt too heavy. The image of the cliffs, so beautiful and timeless, now seemed distant and unreachable. The peaceful world she had believed in, the one she had built around the bookshop, was starting to crumble. "I never wanted you to be part of this, Sophia," Elijah whispered. "But now I think you might be in danger too. You've been too close to me. I've been too close to you." Sophia's mind raced, her thoughts spinning. She wanted to tell him that it wasn't his fault, that she would stand by him no matter what. But the words didn't come. She wasn't sure she even knew who he was anymore. "Please," Elijah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need you to stay away, for your own safety." The room felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on her. The man who had once seemed so perfect, so steady, was now someone she didn't fully understand. She didn't know what to say, didn't know if she should listen to the raw fear in his voice or if she should walk away and let the storm pass. But before she could decide, the sound of a car door slamming outside broke the silence. Elijah's face went pale. "They found me," he said, his eyes wild with panic. "We don't have much time." Sophia's heart hammered in her chest. "What do we do?" He grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward the back door. "We run, and I hope we're fast enough." But as they reached the door, a voice rang out from the front of the shop. "Elijah!" It was Declan. Elijah's grip on her tightened as he turned to face her. "Go," he said urgently. "Go now, and don't look back." Sophia didn't want to leave. She didn't want to let him go, but she knew there was no other choice. With one last, lingering glance, she pulled away, running into the alley behind the shop. The rain had started again, a steady downpour that soaked her to the bone. She didn't look back. The days that followed were nothing like the ones before. The bookshop was closed, a notice hastily tacked to the door. Sophia couldn't bring herself to go back. She didn't know what had happened to Elijah, whether he had escaped or if he was still out there, somewhere, trying to outrun the world that had caught up with him. But as the weeks passed, she began to hear whispers around town. Some said he'd disappeared, others said he'd left Avalon, never to return. And in the quiet of the long nights, Sophia sat by the window, staring out at the cliffs, wondering if she had made the right choice, or if she had just lost the one person who had ever truly understood her. She never found the answers. And sometimes, when the wind howled through the town, she could almost hear Elijah's voice in the distance, calling to her. But by then, it was too late. The end. Let me know if you'd like to explore a different ending or dive deeper into any part of the story.